This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Ghannam.
And I'm Jamal Dejani.
Jamal, it's another kind of fast-breaking week of news and information. We've got a great show today. We're going to be watching a very compelling interview that you did with Ronnie Barkan about medical apartheid and the Israeli regime, which is really fantastic. But we're still in the midst of lots of chaotic unfoldings in terms of the pandemic and the COVID-19 virus. Lots of information, both good and bad, out there, which we may cover depending on the time we have today. And we are facing down, and we'll talk about this later on in the show, we're facing down the cancer of white supremacy in our political system with Marjorie Taylor Green and the Republican Party's refusal to acknowledge the cancer within the party and within this country. So we have a lot of great things to talk about. It's going to be a very fast show, Jamal, so let's get right to it.
That's right, Jess. A lot of news. First, we're going to listen to a conversation with Ronnie Barkan. He's going to pick up on our actually last week's talk, which he watched and he liked. And that was when we reported on the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem's report calling Israel an apartheid state for the first time. But he also just discusses medical apartheid and the role of big pharma companies in this. So let's watch Ronnie. Last week we began the discussion about the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem, which issued a report titled "A Regime of Jewish Supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. This is Apartheid." Ronnie Barkan, a longtime Jewish Israeli activist and math teacher who was raised in Ra'anana near Tel Aviv, is a co-founder of Boycott from Within. He describes himself as a privileged Israeli Jew living at belly of the apartheid beast. Welcome again to Arab Talk, Ronnie.
Thank you for having me, Jamal.
So I'm sure you read the report. This was big news. This is the largest Israeli, nonprofit human rights organization. And it took them a long time to kind of call a spade, use the word, the kind of like the feared A word, apartheid. I mean, it took them many years to do that, even though they've been, in my opinion, doing a very good job documenting the abuses. Why do you think it took them this long?
I think that what we're seeing is actually a change in public perception about the Zionist-Palestinian conflict, if you can even call it a conflict, or what the Zionist race state is all about. And this, because of the change happening outside, thanks mostly to the BDS campaign, to the very successful boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign against Israel, this also affects, in a way, also Israelis themselves, who still cling on very strongly to the notion of apartheid, including organizations like B'Tselem. B'Tselem have a tradition of, let's put it this way, as you mentioned, they are documenting violations in what are regarded as occupied Palestinian territories, the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and they do a very good and credible job there. At the same time, historically, they didn't have a very good political stance. They were ardent liberal Zionists. But they had to transition over time, and we see this also happening with other liberal Zionists out there, people who consider themselves both humanist and Zionist at the same time. And this is a bit of an oxymoron; it cannot coexist. And the more that Israel exposes itself, the more that the BDS campaign is successful in exposing what Israel, the Zionist state, is all about, the more that these people find themselves in a bind, and they have to readapt and also reconsider their own positions. And this report by B'Tselem, I have to commend them for, it is not a perfect report, and I have my criticism on it, and I'm sure we will discuss some of it. At the same time, it is a big step forward. And I have to give them credit where credit is due. and we will discuss the criticism in a bit. I will only mention that in the past they have participated even in Israeli Hasbah, in Israeli propaganda, Zionist propaganda. They have been obviously, as we know, communicating a lot with the Israeli authorities, the military and so on, and only more recently they said we are no longer seeking the approval of the Israeli military authorities. They have been speaking the false discourse about Israel and Palestine as if these are two separate entities, and what this report shows that actually these are not two separate entities. And yes, basically, I would say in a nutshell that they have been documenting violations of human rights very well. As far as their political stance goes, that is a whole other issue. So they have been doing a good job exactly because their activity was limited to the West Bank and Gaza, and it was limited to documentation of these violations. The moment that they spoke about their political stance, then I was not supporting them at all. And I am more inclined to support them these days than in the past.
How is the Israeli public receiving this? I know, at least here in the United States, usually news like this will be kind of, brushed under the table, and it made headlines, which I was surprised because usually the media here, in conjunction with the Congress and wherever, they try to kind of shelter Israel more than the Israeli media itself. Right? They're more protective, but it made headlines that on mainstream media and other sites saying that there was such a report, but it didn't create a lot of debate. Is there a debate now created within the Israeli society?
So first of all, obviously, the people that we should be listening to are the Palestinians, the ones who have been subjugated and oppressed and terrorized ever since the creation of the State of Israel. But it seems like, especially in the West, it is easier for Israeli voices to be heard, and unfortunately, the audience is more interested in that than hearing what the subjugated, oppressed Palestinians have to say. So putting BDS at the forefront, this is obviously putting the Palestinian voice at the forefront. And as far as the B'Tselem goes, I think that when criticism of the very character of the State of Israel comes from Israelis themselves, I know personally, that this has an effect. And with basically my privileged status here, because the whole system is built in order to give privileges to people like myself at the expense of the others, especially if they are the indigenous people to that land. So because I was born into this situation where I am privileged among the privileged group, it also means that I carry more responsibility and I have to speak up. And so this is what I do, and I'm happy that B'Tselem is doing quite the same, that they feel a certain responsibility to speak up about Israeli violations. And it is especially important when they are finally, for the first time, speaking about the very character of the Zionist race state, and not only this or that type of violation that it carries out since its very foundation.
So, of course, we hear this from people like yourself, brave people like yourself. We haven't been hearing this much from politicians like, we hear it from the kind of defunct Labour Party because they're non-existent as far as power. Formerly, the late Meron Benvenisti and Avram Berg, he used the word apartheid. So, do you see any impact from this that's going to change the position of politicians within the government, members of the Knesset, outside the, of course, Arab or Palestinian members there?
So first of all, about the so-called Israeli left. There is no Israeli left and never ever existed. What you have are two different voices coming from the Zionist sphere. One is what I call the honest Zionists, the ones who are racist and proud of it. They are the right wing. And then you have the dishonest ones, the so-called liberal Zionists, the ones who try to square the circle, try to claim that they are both Zionist and humanist at the same time, and this doesn't work. And this is the entirety of the so-called Israeli left, and I'm very happy to see it shrinking dramatically. This is a very good sign. And these people who have been basically identifying themselves as being Zionist left, etc., liberal Zionists, they are, as I mentioned before, they are in a bind and they have to reconsider their position. So all of these are very good signs. The shrinking of the so-called left, etc. Now, at the same time, these people are still far from being allies. They are still far from actually supporting Palestinian rights and supporting the radical notion of equality in this land. So when we talk about apartheid, and this is very important for me to mention, and this is one of the main main criticism that I have about the B'Tselem report. When they refer to apartheid, and it's very good that they also talk about apartheid in South Africa, and they make a point of that. At the same time, first of all, they only speak about 14 million people who are basically living in this territory, in what is regarded as Israel-Palestine. However, they are systematically missing out the most important element, which are those who are in forced exile for the past 7 decades. There are 6 million Palestinian refugees who have been basically Israel, the Zionist race state, and it is a race state by definition from the get-go. It was founded on the basis of ethnically cleansing the land and then doing exactly two things, and that's all that this state is about: making sure that those who have been expelled will never be allowed to come back, and therefore these people are refugees to this day, 7 decades later, 6 million of them. And the second thing that they did was to establish a whole legal system that neatly falls under the legal definition of the crime of apartheid, and to establish a whole legal system that will make sure that those who remained on their land will never, ever be allowed equal standing. Therefore, I was born into a situation where I am the privileged at their expense. So when we talk about apartheid, first and foremost, we have to talk about the 6 billion Palestinians who are in the Shatati and who are in the diaspora, for one and only one reason: for the crime of wrong ethnicity, because they were born to the wrong ethnicity as far as the Zionist race state is concerned. Then there is also apartheid, which is applied in different means within what is regarded as Israel proper, or what we call Palestine 48. And obviously, there's a much clearer case of apartheid, which is very evident when you go to places like Hebron, for example, Khalil, where you have even two, and throughout the entirety of the West Bank, where you have two different legal systems applied for people based on their ethnicity, one for the Israeli settlers, the other for the Palestinians. And Gaza is a whole concentration camp. The Gaza ghetto is there's not only apartheid being practiced there, but this is a monstrous and inhumane siege that is being carried out because these people, who are the majority of them, are refugees from here, from Palestine 48. 70% of Gazans are refugees. And these people have been crammed in there exactly in order not to allow them to come back home. And if you remember, only recently there was the Gaza March of Return, and even organizations like B'Tselem totally distorted what this demonstration was about. It was as if Gazans were demonstrating against the harsh and brutal military siege, but this was only part of it. The whole idea of the March of Return is their demand to go back home. And this is the key issue that we have to talk about: the refugees, the right of return, the 6 million who are denied the right to come back home from the diaspora. And obviously there are more refugees here on this land, even internal refugees that are denied the right to come back home. So when we talk about liberal Zionists acknowledging finally at long last that Israel is an apartheid state, and it is an apartheid state from its very foundation, we have to insist that they will also acknowledge that it is not only apartheid because of what is happening in the West Bank and Gaza. It is not only apartheid because the whole establishment, the very Knesset, the Israeli parliament, is an apartheid parliament. Its very institutions are all about maintaining apartheid, but it is also and especially an apartheid state because it denies people from even living here based on their ethnicity. So
you talk about the institutions, which brings me to the other point. Last time, actually, we tried to bring you on the show, but you were on your way to get your second shot booster shot for the coronavirus. I haven't gotten mine yet here, and I'm older than you in the United States, so Israel is kind of moving very fast. And I wanted to talk to you then about a statement that was made by the Israeli Health Minister Yuli Edelstein when he was asked why Israel wasn't giving the Palestinians in the West Bank, also including them in the vaccination process. And then he said something like, this is like the Palestinian, I'm not responsible, just the same way the Palestinian health minister is not responsible for taking care of the dolphins in the Mediterranean. Like, just this, washing his hands from this responsibility. And then they came under attack, meaning the Israeli health ministry from within Israel, from overseas. He was quoted all over. So to fix that a little bit, I noticed a few days later that Israel decided to give 5,000 doses of the coronavirus coronavirus vaccine to Palestinians, basically healthcare workers. If we look at the main composition of the population, what's $5,000 vaccines going to do to a population which is half, if not more, of the entire population of the people living between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River?
Yes, you're absolutely right. First of all, it is almost a joke to offer 5,000 vaccinations for this population. And besides, it also plays into this whole false discourse, first of all, as if Israel and Palestine are two separate entities, which is the exact opposite. Israel and Palestine have the exact same spot of land. Secondly, the question is, who is responsible for the people living on that land? And for Israel, it is very convenient to throw the blame and the responsibility on, the so-called Palestinian so-called authority or those Hamas who controls Gaza, etc., rather than acknowledging their basic responsibility under international law and obviously morally and otherwise for all the people living on this land. Now, when we look at the situation, first of all, obviously this vaccination case is crystal clear. Okay, it is like what I said before about two different legal systems applied on the same spot of land. If a Palestinian and an Israeli settler in the West Bank are involved in, for example, a car accident, there will be two different legal basically procedures being put in effect, one for the Palestinian, the other for the Israeli. One will go to a civilian court and see a civilian judge, the other will go to a military court, see a military judge, etc. The same rationale also applies to the whole issue of vaccinations, where basically you have neighbors, the Israeli settlers and the Palestinians in the West Bank, and one has full access to full medical care, etc., including vaccinations, which even in the US, you guys are struggling to gain access to. And then the neighboring Palestinian cannot get access to any of that. And obviously we know that the virus does not regard borders. We know that very well. We learned that from experience in the past year. But I'd like to say something else, not only about the vaccinations, but about the whole, actually, what is happening on a daily basis. On a daily basis, there is medical apartheid, and we have to acknowledge that. And Israel, I don't think that we have enough time to go into all the different ways in which Israel applies medical apartheid against the people, the Palestinians, especially the people in Gaza. But basically, they condition medical access on different considerations, political and other considerations. We know that Israel takes no responsibility whatsoever for the people there, and also, by the way, they are not so benevolent, and they don't just offer medical access or treatment, etc. It is all paid for by the ones, the so-called rulers in the West Bank or Gaza. Now, but other than that, when we talk about vaccination, when we talk about what is going on a daily basis, we have to also put into this picture the role of the international pharmaceutical companies. There is a group a collective called Pharma Israel, including, by the way, Pfizer and AstraZeneca, among others. And these pharmaceutical companies, they have this collective in Israel, which is supposed to advance medical access and so on. And they are the ones who are responsible for basically delivering the pharmaceuticals to the West Bank and Gaza. So they have their employees who take care of that, and it is them. They are, let's say, at the very least, facilitating a policy of medical apartheid by basically being these these are the gatekeepers. These are the ones who decide whether the medication will be transferred or not. And I call on all these pharmaceutical companies and all people of the world basically to approach these companies, they're global, not their Israeli branches, and demand that, because they do have a say in that, demand that they make sure that both the people in the West Bank and Gaza have the exact same access to pharmaceuticals as us people in Palestine 48.
I think you're making a very good point, actually. No one is talking about this because people are talking about, medical apartheid. Israel practices medical apartheid. And I was thinking, sure, I know the whole system. Israel has a very good healthcare system. And one thing they try to do, especially for Palestinians living in Jerusalem with the Palestinian ID cards, is kind of one incentive for them is to get rid of them. Like, let's say if somebody decides to move to Ramallah, they strip them from their Palestinian ID card. And the reason they do that, aside from just getting rid of them, period, but also to get them off the healthcare system. Right, so they don't want them to be, that's the only benefit probably for Palestinians living in Jerusalem, and they pay the Israeli tax, the arnona and everything else. But if they can't afford living in Jerusalem, and many of them, especially the young people, they move outside the borders, the area, because it's cheaper for them to live in Ram or somewhere else, like outside or Ramallah, and they lose their identity card. And one of the main purpose for doing that is to get them off the national healthcare system. But what you're saying, which is very important, because a lot of people know that Israel, when it comes to, for example, the vaccine from Pfizer and Moderna, they're being used as a testing ground. So they're getting it for free. They're getting it for free because Israel, is a smaller country and they can get the results very quickly.
Everything is monitored very carefully, including by the Shin Bet.
Yeah, and so what's happening really is now what you're also putting the blame on these big mega pharma companies, American and international ones, is that they are collaborating with the apartheid regime by excluding half of the population from this free kind of experiment, when very clearly, you're very familiar with the land there, some of these settlements are just few hundred feet away from Palestinian towns and villages. There is no way you can separate the population, and not to mention all the checkpoints and the Israeli soldiers coming in contact with Palestinians. Yeah, I think that's a very valid point.
Yes, I agree with you. And we also have to mention that there is also basically, this apartheid system is so, it is multi-layered, just like what you're seeing in the background, that you have all these systems of control that are put in place. And also when we look at the way that Palestinians gain access to medical facilities and medical care, you can see that very clearly. Now, again, we don't have time to go into all the details, but it is very clear. So when we talk about the role of pharmaceutical companies from abroad, yes, I think they do have a say, and they shouldn't agree to facilitate apartheid on their behalf.
So is that a campaign, quickly, we have a couple of minutes, is there a campaign to kind of send a strong message from your organization and other, progressive Israelis that what you're doing is wrong. I mean, maybe you can get through to the Israeli government, but maybe you can make some headway with the big pharmaceutical companies, whether they are in Belgium or in the United States.
So I'd like to take the opportunity that we are discussing very seriously the whole issue of vaccinations these days and who gains access to these vaccinations, who doesn't and who don't. And we also have to put into the picture basically the entirety of Africa, a large part of Asia, etc. That, what about all these people? I mean, we really have to demand that all the people of the world, this is a global pandemic, all people of the world will have access. And we have even different types of vaccinations. So it is definitely doable. The question is, again, whether the people who are currently in power, what do they do, and whether they basically act according to, are they responsible enough? Do they abide by their obligations? And we, the people of the world, obviously have to demand that. So, this is a call from Palestine about full equality, both in the legal sphere and also with regard to access to medical care.
So and vaccination is not really a privilege.
To the rest of the world, including these specific pharmaceutical companies. I think that also you mentioned that Israel is basically holding this experiment here with the pharmaceuticals, and we know about different things that are happening. And also at the same time, I will just mention that we know very well that Israel is also holding experiments in Gaza and the West Bank with regard to its weapon manufacturing. They are selling to the world weapons that have been literally tested on Palestinians. And I don't know the facts about what they do with regard to the question of the pandemic and Gaza, for example. I wouldn't be surprised to learn in the future that there was quite a sinister approach that was also treating Gaza as some sort of a laboratory. I don't know that. I hope that I will be mistaken in the future, but this is another concern that I have. What is Israel doing, and should we allow it to experiment so freely on people's lives?
Well, that's a valid question, Ronnie. Ronnie, I want to thank you again for coming on Arab Talk. I'm glad that you got your 2 shots of the vaccine, so now you're safe.
Soon I hope that you will have access to it.
And hopefully, the vaccine should not be a privilege, and everyone should have it. And we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you very much.
Well, that's the face and the voice of Ronnie Barkan giving a very compelling analysis of medical apartheid, which we did touch upon last week, Jamal. And before we dive into Ronnie's comments, which I think were spot on, the mainstream media here in the United States has been complicit, along with Big Pharma, in portraying the Israeli pandemic response and their vaccination program as a model to be celebrated in the world, when in fact it's a model that needs to be criticized and denigrated as immoral, unethical, and should be called out for the medical apartheid that it's been engaging with. It has not vaccinated the bulk of the people in historic Palestine, as we know, and it's deliberately leaving out millions of Palestinians in the cold. It's really a painful example of what medical apartheid is.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Just this is what actually Ronnie talked about, and I think he made a very good points. Of course, he supports the B'Tselem's report, even though he's critical about some of the stuff that they've done before until they kind of made up their mind and to call Israel as apartheid. He also kind of talks about the exclusion of Palestinians in diaspora. So when they talk about only, what's happening on the ground, it does not cover what happens to Palestinians who have been ethnically cleansed, or their children or grandchildren trying to return or even visit the country. So he takes it a step further. The other part, when we start talking about remember last week we commented on the statement of the Israeli health minister,
Yes.
saying that he's not responsible for vaccinating Palestinians, and we've discussed this in details, and how is this a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. And but then Israel came under a lot of criticism internationally. Even in the United States, his statement was carried in U.S. media when he said, "I'm not responsible," and I'm just paraphrasing, "to vaccinate Palestinians, just like the Palestinian health minister is not responsible for dolphins in the sea." Some ludicrous statement, as usual, came under a lot of fire internally and externally. And then the Israeli government decided to send 5,000 doses just of vaccine to Palestinian health workers. So we're talking about the people who live between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, combined population of 15 to 16 million people. Half of them or more even are Palestinians, and Palestinians are receiving only 5,000 vaccines.
Well, that's why.
What's that going to do?
Right, and that's why it's medical apartheid. That's why it's unethical. That's why it's immoral. And that's why the news media continues to be complicit. And I'll give you an example, Jamal, that Bill Neely, a very well-known correspondent for NBC News just a few days ago, did a 5-minute story on the amazing successes of the Israeli vaccination program, even put up a map to show, how successful it is. Interviewed Israeli officials, not a single word or mention of the, 6.5, 7 million Palestinians left in the cold, literally and figuratively, given that we're in the wintertime. And, 5,000 doses of vaccine for, 6.5 million people is just not going to cut it. And when B'Tselem said that Israel is an apartheid state, politically it's apartheid, but we know for sure now that it's also medically apartheid, because the Palestinian COVID pandemic is really hitting Palestinians very hard right now, Jamal. And of course, Palestinian health workers in the West Bank. What about Palestinian health workers in Gaza, Jamal? What about those individuals where the pandemic is especially difficult and problematic right now? We're hearing nothing.
That's right. And here is the thing, Jess. I mean, Ronnie Barkan, of course, talks about, medical apartheid, not just because of COVID, pre-COVID. Because as you know, only Palestinians living in Jerusalem receive or under the Israeli national health care, and Palestinians in the West Bank, that's about 2.6, 2.7 million of them. Gaza, about another 2 million there. They're excluded, and Israel plays this policy of stripping Palestinians living in Jerusalem from their health plan, right, for the smallest reason. Like, let's say, if they get married to someone from the West Bank, their children and their wife they don't receive health care. If they decide to live outside the borders or the boundaries of Jerusalem, they lose their Israeli ID, therefore they lose their health plan. But I think what the important point here, because, we know what's happening in Israel, we've been talking about it for ages. This is the first time people are using this tabooed word, apartheid, the big A word. Even in U.S. media now, you're reading about it. The U.S. media, for the very first time, actually has covered the B'Tselem story as breaking news. Usually they try to just ignore something like this happening. But the bigger story, Jess, and I think this is really important to emphasize, Israel has received their vaccine doses for free from Pfizer, that I know for sure, and Moderna. And, those are big, gigantic companies that made that decision to give the vaccine to Israel as an experiment because they can study the effect on the population. Supposedly, Israel can deliver it very fast, and they've been delivering it very fast. But are they ignorant that Israel controls another 6 million Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza? Are they ignorant about that they also have an obligation under the Fourth Geneva Convention?
I have breaking news for you. They're not ignorant. The leaders of Pfizer and Moderna, and also AstraZeneca, as well as J&J, Johnson & Johnson, they're not ignorant of the political dynamics and political realities on the ground. Big Pharma decided to collude with the apartheid regime of Israel and decided to collude with them and just giving free doses of vaccine to half of the population, barely half of the population of historic Palestine, leaving Palestinians in the cold and excluded from their right under the Geneva Convention, under medical ethics, their right to get vaccinated just like every Israeli. So I think you're right, Jamal. This is a huge story. Big Pharma in collusion with the apartheid state of Israel. And now I think what we need to do when we think about the BDS campaign and we think about other political efforts to call out, companies that do business in settlements and occupied and excluding occupied territories, we need to call Big Pharma out, just like we're calling out all the other BDS companies that illegally do business. This is just as egregious, in my opinion, as any other BDS invocation to call out some of these companies.
Well, then this is really the big story because, we expect that from Israel. I didn't expect anything better, that out of the goodness of their heart, they're going to take care of the well-being of the people in Gaza from a regime that counts the calories. People maybe have forgotten about this story, how Israel controls everything that is shipped into the Gaza Strip, and they basically let it trickle into there because they count the calories of Palestinians and they don't allow certain material to enter, rebuilding for construction and so forth. They control every single item basically going through the Eretz cross points, checkpoints. And now we have a global catastrophe, Jess, and I didn't expect them to order. If they were paying for it, they weren't going to order more vaccines to give to Palestinians. And they are in control. And they are in control. They control every aspect of Palestinian lives. But I did not expect, once I started delving more into it and knowing that Pfizer and other companies have made a deal to give Israel the vaccine for free when many countries don't have it. And we haven't even talked about other countries in Africa and Asia and South America.
Well, actually, we have spoken about it, Jamal, and there's...
No, we spoke about that, but I'm just saying, I'm talking on these are separate issues. Even though they're connected, you're talking about Big Pharma is involved, not excluding countries because they can't buy it or they don't have the means to purchase it or deliver it. We are talking about Big Pharma colluding with an apartheid regime, which basically runs people's life according to two separate laws, and they're aware, they have scientists that the population between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea is about 15 to 16 million, and yet they've only taken care of half of that population. Totally excluded on ethnic lines, half the population.
Well, that's right, Jamal. And I do think that's the big story. But I will tell you that the apartheid regime of Israel colluding with Big Pharma doesn't stop at the Israeli checkpoint. it actually goes further in terms of what's happening in Africa and what's happening in Central and South America, because not everybody is getting that vaccine for free. And really poor countries are being forced to not have access to the vaccines as freely as Israelis are getting. And we have to rely on countries like Canada, Japan, and New Zealand to buy excess vaccine that is not free. They're buying it and attempting to distribute it in Africa, in Central America, and South America, because this story, if it were really to get out and people were to really hear about apartheid medicine being practiced in Israel and the collusion in Israel, and with collusion with big pharma, people would truly be shocked at the level of immorality and unethical behavior that big pharma. But this is nothing new to big.
You know what killed me yesterday is the news I read on, I think, CNBC website. Basically, they just had a report that made it sound like, it's such a great thing that Israel is doing. Said Israel has decided to transfer 5,000 doses to the Palestinian Authority to give to its healthcare workers, and they stopped short of painting the full picture. Just imagine people in this country. Imagine if the news in this country that the Trump administration or now the Biden administration has decided to buy enough vaccine for whites only and excluded blacks and excluded Latinos. Just imagine.
Well, we kind of do have that here, Jamal, unfortunately, because there's a little bit of medical apartheid going on in the United States too.
Well, this is on socioeconomic.
Because the reality is, Jamal, Latinos, African Americans, folks of colors are getting substantially less access and availability of the vaccine than everybody else. So we can't let this country off the hook. We have to call out the apartheid regime of Israel for sure, and we have to call out Big Pharma. The difference here, it's part of a systematic, 200-year, 400-year process of doing the effects of, the long-term effects of ethnic cleansing and slavery here have, taken their toll on the African-American community. But we have health disparities and health inequities here too that mirror what the Israelis are doing to Palestinians in historic Palestine. It's just that in apartheid Israel, Jamal, it's just more egregious. And I would say the other difference, people don't care about it. The media doesn't care about medical apartheid with the Israeli regime. They will pay attention to it here with Latinos, African Americans, and other communities of color not getting vaccinated at as high a rate. But when it comes to the Israeli regime and its apartheid practices, they get a pass, not only from CNBC, NBC, CNN, CBS, all of them, and they need to be called out.
Well, I'm still waiting for that story to kind of...
It hasn't come out, Jamal.
People to start talking about it. And
it's not.
Definitely on a global level, I don't know what is it going to be, the World Health Organization or other human rights organizations should hold Big Pharma responsible for what happens in Palestine, for the mere fact of basically giving vaccine for free to one segment of the population and ignoring the other segment of the population.
Sure, Jamal, but I said this last week, and I'm going to say it again. The Israelis are really kind of stupid and ignorant in their racism and medical apartheid, because historic Palestine is not that big, as we know, Jamal. And if you choose not to vaccinate half of the population in historic Palestine and think that you're going to be protecting one population over another by vaccinating one and not the other, you are not just delusional. You're in another. You're not in reality, because unless the entire world gets vaccinated, unless everybody gets vaccinated, unless there's global herd immunity, we're headed for some very, very dark times. And the Israelis can't outrun COVID-19, especially if it mutates. It knows no borders. So they're doing this not just out of ignorance and malice, but they're not in reality.
Well, obviously they're doing it because of ignorance and malice. And the proof to this is they try to kind of, calm the situation down by doing another stupid mistake by sending just 5,000 doses and hoping that the news will disappear and people will applaud them for doing this when they are in fact under international law, under the Fourth Geneva Convention, responsible for all the population under their control, which includes the West Bank and Gaza.
Right, Jamal, but just one last point. I'm sorry to kind of keep hammering this. The Israelis are going to have surges because their extremist right-wing ultra-Orthodox religious communities are refusing to take the vaccine, and that's not a small number of people.
And others, actually, they are. Even young people are refusing. Israel, by the way, is down to asking for anyone 16 or over to go and get the vaccine, while we are in this country, they're still working on 75 and over. Anyway, we will keep monitoring this topic, Jess. You're listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM, and I want to shift gears here and go to domestic issues in the news for the entire week. Is the story of the Republican Representative Marjorie Taylor Green, which faces today, maybe even this will be by the end of the day, a vote to strip her from her committee assignments over her history, basically, of trafficking, racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, conspiracy theories, and including, by the way, supporting violence against Democrats prior to taking office. So, of course, the Republicans are resisting this, of doing this. I'm sure you watched yesterday.
I did.
Their leader, McCarthy, coming and issuing a statement and saying, and this makes you lose hair, and I don't have much of it left, basically, is he's saying just that, well, this happened before she was, elected to the House. And now she can just say a statement, or she said a statement that she denies, or she refutes, or she apologizes. She didn't apologize, or kind of changes, backtracks what she said.
She didn't apologize, Jamal.
Yeah, she's backtracking, said, 9/11 did happen before she said it didn't happen. Yes, those children that got murdered in schools, that wasn't a conspiracy theory, and it did happen. She was talking about, that, of course, statements like the Rothschilds were behind, and the Jews behind the fires, using laser beams from space, setting fires in California to make money. I mean, some crazy stuff. I'm just feeling nervous just reciting the stuff she has said, just the racist stuff. And then he came and said, well, this happened before. This is like akin to me, just like, Jeffrey Dahmer getting elected to Congress and renouncing cannibalism. And they said, okay, that's fine. He renounced cannibalism. So now we can have him as a member of Congress. I mean, we are talking now about just stripping her from committees, important committees like the education and others, not getting this person shouldn't be in Congress, Jess.
But Jamal, it's actually even a little worse than what you just said. If Jeffrey Dahmer renounced cannibalism, that's better than what Marjorie Taylor Green has done, because she hasn't renounced the totality of her racism and her white supremacy. In fact, if you look at her tweets yesterday, she said, the Democrats are making me stronger. Coming after me was making me stronger. It just proves my point. She is not remorseful. She is not contrite. She has not apologized. She represents a segment of this society, Jamal, a cancer in our society of white supremacy and conspiracy theorists. It's not an insignificant part of our society, and it's fomented continuously by now leadership in the Republican Party, not just limited to Kevin McCarthy, the minority leader in the House, but let's not forget the ex-president of the United States, Donald J. Trump, is still fomenting these ideas, is still not done anything to combat these ideas. We are in a very bad situation, Jamal. I think we have to face up to this as a country. The Republicans are facing extinction as a party as they once knew it, because if they're unable to announce this kind of white supremacy, this kind of racism, this kind of, and I'll just say it, denial of reality, if they are unable to confront a congresswoman who denies truth and reality, they will never win another election. They are headed at their own peril for their own demise. This is an easy one, Jamal. This is easy. You have a congressman.
It's easy for you and me, Jess, but I don't know if it's easy for that segment of society, the examples of which we saw basically invading the Capitol, because I don't know if I agree with your statement that they will never win another election, because obviously people in Georgia voted her in, voted to send her to Congress. I mean, here we are, and I feel what has been weakened is the institution, because they have set the bar so low that someone with a history, long history of anti-Semitism, racism, Islamophobia, etc., can get elected to, and now they can get elected to Congress, and now all that they are debating is whether she should be on a committee. They're not even talking about expelling her from Congress, and that's really the danger part. But not sure, like all these people like Ted Cruz, people like her and Rubio, they have people behind them. They have people who give them money and people who vote for them.
Sure. Let me just restate what I should have said. Of course, white supremacists will win more elections, but what I meant to say, and to be more precise, whether or not they could take over the House, whether they could take over the Senate, and whether they could take over the executive branch again, the Republicans basically have a year or so to either confront this and remove it, like you have to remove any cancer, or they're going to accept it and see if somehow they can embrace psychosis, denial of reality, and denial of truth with typical Republican principles. You can't have it both ways, I believe. That's what Kevin McCarthy's trying to do, Jamal. He's saying, well, Liz Cheney's not a bad person. We support her. But I'd like to remind you something, Jamal. Did you know that Marjorie Taylor Green, when she gave her comment to the caucus of Republicans after she was done, she got a standing ovation in the Congress.
And also, you mentioned Liz Cheney. That's just kind of related to this, that people actually voted to against Liz Cheney's leadership, even though she managed to stay on. There were, I think, 46 congressmen and congresswomen who voted to get rid of her as the number three lead on the leadership of the GOP.
Right.
But here is the deflection. We keep hearing about this cancel culture. That's what Marjorie Taylor was talking about actually yesterday, after she was backtracking on some of her statements. Now she says she's the victim of the cancel culture.
White supremacists are the victim of cancel culture.
So what's that?
Here's what it is, Jamal. What it is accountability culture. And what's happening to these extremists, these white supremacist extremists, when they're held to account for their hate speech, when they're held to account for their incitement to sedition, when they're held to account to our justice system, they call it cancel culture instead of calling it what it is. And what it is, Jamal, is if you act in a way that's illegal, immoral, unethical, you are held to account. And it seems like white supremacists like to refer to cancel culture as an excuse for being held accountable to the systems that we have here in this country.
So the other thing in their deflection, aside from the cancel culture, and this has come up before, Jess, is of course when One of their own is under attack. Who do they bring up?
Ilhan Omar.
Yeah, so it's just like out of the blue, just like Donald Trump was always like attacking her. They go after one of the Muslim women in Congress, one of the women who's black, and also, of course, she's an immigrant. She wears a hijab. She embodies all their fears, and so all of a sudden they're saying, "Well, I don't know why you're going after, Marjorie Green. The Democrats gave Ilhan Omar a pass."
There's no correlation and no equivalency between Ilhan Omar, who accepts reality, who accepts truth, and when she was called out on some comments which were at the very least insensitive. You know what Ilhan Omar did? She apologized. She apologized verbally, in person, on air. She apologized in a written form. She took responsibility for making insensitive comments, Jamal. Marjorie Taylor Green, and this is what all the Republicans are doing who are part of this QAnon white supremacist group. What they're doing, Jamal, if you look at it, they're doubling down. Marjorie Green is not contrite. She's doubling down. She's raising money. She's saying they're attacking me for what I believe in. And what she believes in, Jamal, is a crazy world in which Israeli lasers are starting fires near where we live in Northern California.
Not Israeli lasers, as she said, it's lasers funded by the Rothschilds. So Jewish lasers, just like to distinguish. She's spreading this trope of anti-Semitism that the Jews are behind everything to make money.
It's crazy, man.
Because of it. And she didn't apologize. Actually, she didn't backtrack on this one here. And the thing is, she denied this. She denied a lot of things, but there are screenshots. These are things that not only that she said in public, and they were recorded, many of them, and the others are all over her Facebook and
Twitter,
Instagram, and social media accounts. And then she says, "Oh, I don't think I said this." It's all there, the evidence, and we're not talking about a statement or two. You've mentioned, that Ilhan attributed to Ilhan Omar. This is many, many years in the making of all kinds of crazy and racist stuff.
I don't think the Republicans are going to be able to come clean, Jamal. And I think the Democrats, if they're smart enough, they'll use it in every single congressional race coming up in 2022 against both in the House as well as the Senate, because they're not going to be able to come through this. And Donald Trump is not going to back down. He's going to form a patriot party. And as I predicted, I'm sorry to say this, white supremacy and Donald Trump are not going away after this election.
On this bad note, we're coming to another end of another show, Jess. So we
keep watching. We got lots of news.
Keep watching. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest episodes, and we'll keep informing you in the next coming weeks.
We'll see you next week.